Welcome everyone, and thank you for being here for this last panel on the role of the UK in the Indo-Pacific. So during these days we have discussed in great depth the relations between Europe and China, as well as like Europe's role, if there is any role in the Indo-Pacific. We have discussed how the UK and the EU have increased their interest into this macro area, and how important this macro area is for the strategic and economic interests of the UK. We have discussed a lot about the role of the US in the area as well, and what this new Trump administration means for the relations between Europe and the different partners in the Indo-Pacific area. So now we will discuss and assess what is the role of the UK in the Indo-Pacific area. We can explore how the UK is building and strengthening relations with other partners in the area, like from maybe a defense perspective, as well as like an economics perspective, and as well as like cultural exchange, for example. And we can also assess whether how the UK can build this role and can is perceived also from Asian partners in the area. Whether this is through bilateral relations or through aligned systems such as NATO or the Quad. So today we have a great panel of distinguished speakers. So we have Dr. Winnie King, who is a senior lecturer in Chinese International Political Economy at the University of Bristol. And then we have Professor Carl Stephen Patrick Hunter, OBE, who is the Director General of the Durham Institute of Research, Development and Invention. He is also the Chairman of Cultraco Ultrasonics, Director of the Center for Underwater Acoustic Analysis, Chairman of the Council of Geostrategy Forum, and he also holds different positions as a senior advisor at the British government. And then we have Rear Admiral Mike Studeman, who is a National Security Fellow, a Mitre Corporation, and also he is a Navy veteran. And then John is currently co-chairing the session as well. So maybe, I don't know if John, if you want to give a few remarks, and maybe then we can give the word to Winnie.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. This is an unusual process to have two chairs for a panel. So we were trying to think, how are we going to do this? And you'll see that we've positioned ourselves strategically around our guests, so there's no escaping.
Containment.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think all I will say very, very briefly, because we want to hear from our distinguished panelists, is, again, to repeat some of the things we observed from really the beginning of this whole conference, starting in London at RUSI. The expectation that next week there will be the announcement of a number of important signature documents that highlight Britain's role globally, but also in the Indo-Pacific, the Strategic Defence Review, National Security Strategy, and we are on the edge of our seats, figuratively and literally in some cases, waiting to see what will be said, particularly when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. I think what I noticed, which I think is a really significant change since 2021 and the Integrated Review, you know, when the Integrated Review came out, there was a sense that it was a response to Brexit, a desire to compensate for our loss of influence or our perceived loss of influence in Europe. I think a recognition that Britain needed to set the bar very high in terms of ambition. And as I think I said on a previous panel, this involved being the most important security actor, both in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. In the wake of the Integrated Review, there were a number of criticisms, including from senior civil servant Simon MacDonald, for example, who was very, I think, acerbically critical of this idea of global Britain and what it represented. It seemed to be more rhetoric than substance. And there was also a perception that I think Britain's approach, while setting these ambitious targets, was commendable at one level. There was a danger that there was a lack of strategic coherence, of a willingness to match means and objectives, means and ends. In 2023, the Integrated Review Refresh came out, which sought to address some of those challenges by focusing on China as a systemic competitor, talking very deliberately about the importance of bolstering defense and deterrence, and also recognizing, as has been said in a number of panels over the last day or so, the importance of integrating the economy and security. So that represents, I think, a step in the right direction. The other element, which I'm sure we'll want to discuss when we think about that critical question of ends and means, is who are our natural partners in the region? Britain has had a long relationship with ASEAN. It has an increasingly active security partnership with Japan. I sit on a body called the UK-Japan 21st Century Group, and we meet once a year to talk about what we might do together. And I've been struck over the last, more than a decade, of how ambitious the agenda becomes and has become reinforced by really important new agreements. The GCAP Joint Fighter Aircraft Program, involving not just Japan and the UK, but also Italy, the Reciprocal Access Agreement, strengthening cooperation between our two militaries, but also a recognition, particularly after Britain joined CPTPP, that our interests are increasingly common. But there's much more to be said in areas, for example, to do with intelligence, with information, and as our own domestic societies begin to grapple with the impact of Donald Trump 2.0, it's going to open up space for new innovative ideas. So I'm really interested to hear from the panelists who we should be working with, how far this ambition needs to be expanded and developed, and what are the real constraints, particularly, of course, given all the concerns about capacity, the pull of the European theatre, and an issue which, of course, all of you will be thinking about, which is public opinion. How do you convince the British public that this is a game worth being engaged in? Those are my opening remarks. Well, I'll pass back to Alice to invite our speakers to give their...
Yes, I think Winnie, if you would like to start.
Okay. Thank you very much to the Center of Geopolitics for inviting me. This is my third time here, and shout out to Bill for condoning my presence each and every time. Last year we talked a lot about capacity, UK's capacity and capability, and we had a very interesting discussion about what the FCDO has been doing in terms of the UK's role, and not just in the region generally, but also with regards to China, because I'm a China scholar. I'm hoping to be more positive this year. I think I want to begin, if we're talking about not just UK capacity and capability, but its strengths and opportunities within the Indo-Pacific, and I think we very much can root it within a lot of the UK's historical reputation and its experiences. And obviously we know the UK is very, very, very strong historically in the area of diplomacy. It has, not just in terms of being a leader on the international stage, but having had obviously a major driving player and role within the establishment of the international order, multilateral institutions, establishment of international law. And that role of leadership was extremely valuable in terms of not just, after World War II, the idea of the UK not necessarily being the hegemon anymore, but still having a significant role as a potential, a reasonable great power within the international system. We have consistently, when it comes to China and the international order, have been leaders in the area of promoting norms and values, whether it's democracy and human rights, responsibility to protect. And if we look at our reputation for transparency and consistency, it's not anything that you can really challenge on that, right? It's just a given. If we look at the current government in terms under Starmer, I want to preface this, I should have said, this is my personal opinion, okay? So I'm not representing any kind of organization or my university in this, it's just my personal opinion. But the activities in the Stormer is very much, even though we have a Trump-shaped hole in the international order in terms of leadership and talking about neoliberalism and free trade and stuff like that, the UK has continued to remain consistent in our commitment to the free trade order and international trade, whether it's in the form of free trade agreements with India, joining the CPTPP, increasingly working with ASEAN to basically try and establish something more significant, and obviously reestablishing, as Starmer's priority, reestablishing our relationship with the European Union and rebuilding that bridge. In the case of Taiwan, the UK has made concerted efforts to try and strengthen and bolster our relationship upon multifaceted levels, right? Not just economics, but even cultural and et cetera. And so when it comes to the integrated review and the refresh and the coming refresh of the refresh, I think the key thing that we need to try and really identify, given our question about UK's role within the Indo-Pacific and what kind of contribution it could make, we need to see where we see ourselves, and we need more substance around this idea of this epoch-defining role that China may represent to not just the international order, but as we're talking about here in terms of the Indo-Pacific. And we can't be passive about that, because we have to know what it is we want. What is our end game? What is it that we want out of this whole situation, okay? The key thing that I think that we need to consider is that, and this happened this morning, or this evening if you're in Asia, the IISS, the Shangri-La Dialogue, where the US Secretary of Defense Hesketh says, the Indo-Pacific is the US's priority theater, okay? And that there's an expected burden-sharing approach that the Americans are going to take on when it comes to targeting what China is deemed to be in terms of being a challenge and a threat on the international stage. And I think when we're talking about what the UK, role the UK is going to have with regards to the Indo-Pacific, we need to also recognize that that our vision of what the Indo-Pacific is, and shout out to Kath Jones for, inspiring me for this. Our vision of the Indo-Pacific is not the same as our allies. Okay, so the U.S., the EU, Japan, India, all have a different vision of what the Indo-Pacific is. Okay, Japan and the EU, for instance, include Eastern Africa in the Indo-Pacific, as an example. Okay, and so, while technically this isn't an issue, the idea of our role within the Indo-Pacific also needs to take into account that the new Trump government sees something different when it comes to this idea of what China may represent as a challenge on the international stage. It's not just linked to the Indo-Pacific territorially. In fact, Hegseth talked about the idea that China's growing footprint internationally, in particular with regards to the Panama Canal, means that the challenge that China represents for the Indo-Pacific is now global. And so when that's the case, what does that mean for the UK in terms of having a role and a responsibility as is expected by not just America, but our role as being a constructive player within the Indo-Pacific? Are we, number one, willing to take on this vision of what the Americans deem to be Indo-Pacific and also the challenge that China may represent for what they deem to be their Indo-Pacific strategy? Because our Indo-Pacific tilt does not follow that same line, okay? And secondly, how committed are we to being a team player according to the American agenda, okay? And that kind of role and expectation represents to us, even though we have quite a long list of advantages and opportunities and strengths, significant risks and hurdles that the UK has to face when it comes to what it is that we're willing to do for the Indo-Pacific and in the Indo-Pacific. our reputation today, I've already mentioned it, what it's like historically, our reputation today, and having spoken to, I was in China recently, the discussion becomes a matter of the UK was a great power. The UK now is not to be taken seriously, okay? That's not me speaking, that's having spoken to people in Asia, okay? And one of the key issues becomes a matter of the fact that we have significant vulnerabilities that recent governments, several governments, have represented in terms of our, not just internationally in terms of our resilience to actually have a consistent role on the international stage, but also how domestically we have limitations to what it is we can do because of the state of our economy, because our national security documents have not been transparent and concise about what it is that we're willing to do and how far we're willing to go and how committed we are to that struggle and that challenge. And so this leads to an inconsistency in terms of how the UK is seen in the Indo-Pacific itself. And our success necessitates, therefore, a commitment, not just the idea we have capacity and we have capability, but we are missing a willingness to commit to that. And we need greater clarity and transparency around what exactly our own strategy is towards the Indo-Pacific. Because even if we're not willing to be a team player for the Americans, what does our fit look like with regards to Indo-Pacific? Example would be if we're talking about diplomacy. We have currently our Parliamentary Undersecretary for the Indo-Pacific, Catherine West, fabulous, very, very effective, but her position was downgraded once Starmer came to power. It was originally a minister for the Indo-Pacific, okay? And what does that downgrading represent in terms of our commitment to the Indo-Pacific itself, right? And how much we're willing to commit and engage with that environment. I think I wanted to, I'm almost done. I think the consistency in terms of dialogue that we traditionally have and diplomacy that we traditionally have engaged with is something that we need to really embrace. But the continuity that has been raised a lot in terms of other panels, that the change that's going on under Trump 2.0, but I believe has continued even before, originated even before Trump 1.0. The continuity actually is problematic because the continuity that we saw within the UK as having a significant role to play on the international stage cannot be continued. We need to have a different type of UK that's willing to take, if not a leadership role, then definitely finding the niches and the sectors where we can have a leading role, which is, an academic kind of twist to it. But so stepping away from more of a halfway house and having greater clarity about what it is that we want to do and becoming more relevant on the international stage. An example would be, okay, so I found this quote. Andrew Cavendish, 11th Duke of Devonshire, okay? It's not, there's a reason why I'm including him. He's the former Minister of State for Commonwealth Relations, 1962 to 1964. But before this, he was the Parliamentary Undersecretary for the Commonwealth Relations, 1960 to 1962, okay? So we now have Catherine West. So the Minister for the Indo-Pacific was established, the office was established in 2002, okay? Yeah, 2002. And then was downgraded when, in 2004 when Starmer came to power, the Labour government. And Andrew Cavendish said, no one with, I don't even, can I read my writing? No one who has been in the Parliamentary Undersecretary of State position has any conception of how unimportant this role is. Yeah? And what I'm trying to say is there is a lot of potential, but our position right now suggests that we're not taking ownership of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winnie. It was incredibly interesting. We we'll definitely come back to what you said later, especially in regard to like this continuity instead of like change. There was like really great insight, and like just related to what you just said about the need to find sectors where we can lead, and I wanted to ask Carl. Where do you see these sectors of where the UK can be a leader in the Indo-Pacific, and where instead do you identify the main challenges for the UK would face in crafting its role in the Indo-Pacific?
Do you want me to answer that question, or shall I just go on?
As you want.
Right. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to you and Dr. John for your kindness today, and also people like Dr. Bill and Professor Brendan, who really should be commended for all their contributing to this country. My comments are going to be purely personal ones, but I would like to make a particular, express my gratitude to, my definition of brilliance is to be of fine heart and fine mind, and I cannot tell you the intensity with which I found such people in Whitehall. I'd therefore like to thank the civil servants and uniformed officers that I work with, and thank them very much for their public service. Reassessing the role of the United Kingdom in the Indo-Pacific is effectively a discussion, as you said, Dr. Alice, about leadership. And so I'd just like to begin with saying something that I came across today, which is, you don't spoil the joke, which is that sage leadership has always been the hidden success of our nation. The best teachers perpetually strive to make tomorrow's performance better than yesterday's. And pressure is a necessary precondition for high-performing success, according to Admiral Mike. So there's no doubt in my mind that as we reassess the role of the United Kingdom in the Indo-Pacific, we need to develop our understanding of the United Kingdom's role globally, much as we did in the Integrated Review and Integrated Review Refresh, as has been mentioned, for which I'd like to thank particularly Professor John Bew at number 10, with whom I worked very, very modestly. We also need a national understanding of the United Kingdom at home in the form, in my view, of a domestic integrated review, so that we then begin to answer your point, Dr. Winnie, as to who we are and why we exist. And that would be on the path to identifying things that we are understanding or beginning to understand better, such as war resilience and war preparedness. But more importantly, it would perhaps lead us to a politically colourless national strategy for a long-term 75-year timeline, which would coincide with the timeline that we have within AUKUS. Because the Indo-Pacific strategic importance continues to grow inexorably as the world's economic centre of gravity shifts eastwards and as the Indo-Pacific becomes the main global source of economic growth. Japan boasts as you heard from Dr. Joan earlier, the world's third or fourth largest GDP and is an active promoter of regional trade liberalisation. South Korea is Asia's fourth largest economy and ranks 14th in the world by nominal GDP. And the Indo-Pacific overall accounts for 54% of global GDP's growth in real terms between 2021 and 2050, compared to only 9% from, say, the European Union. Furthermore, the Indo-Pacific is vital from a defence, security, maritime and legal perspective. It's critical to uphold the things that enable that in the rules-based international order. And the region is central to our collective success in combating global challenges from climate change to maritime security. And in essence, the ambition for the United Kingdom should be to progress from what we created with the United States from 1945 on, which is that rules-based international order today. And that means that we have to understand what's in the United States' mind first, because they really are our special friend and ally across all domains, no matter what we may think at the moment of interruption in the White House. We can't afford, therefore, to ignore the Indo-Pacific, nor view the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific as binary choices in a zero-sum game. The Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions are inextricably linked. Ukraine is a stark exemplar of this. China is an instrumental enabler of Russia's ongoing illegal invasion, and North Korea has deployed 10,000 troops to support Russia's war efforts. The deepening cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea threatens to exacerbate and accelerate security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, undermining safety and security and catalyzing existing tensions and disputes. The UK must promote a free and open Indo-Pacific underpinned by the rules-based international order, whether it likes it or not, but certainly for collective security, governance, trade and growth. They are the ingredients of global stability, security and prosperity. China's interactions with the rules-based international order have been characterized by a selective adherence to its rules, a willingness to escalate or retaliate to actions on the global stage using grey zone operations and other. China continues to pursue unprecedented military modernization and increasingly belligerent behavior that threatens regional stability, our allies and our partners. And wherever a friend or partner is located geographically, they are just that first. They're your friend. So it doesn't matter where the friend is when it's in need. You have to be where your friend is. They're developing and integrating cutting-edge technologies, hypersonics, AI, uncrewed systems and advanced missilery, and counter-space capabilities at an alarming pace. It doesn't daunt me. It just means that we have to pick ourselves up. This military modernization remains focused on Taiwan, and we should remind ourselves that it is the CCP that leads China and views unification with Taiwan as a fundamental condition of national rejuvenation, which must be accomplished at least by 2049. To that end, the PLA is aggressively developing capabilities to provide options for the PRC to dissuade, deter, or if ordered, defeat third-party intervention on the Asia-Pacific region. This represents one of the biggest threats therein. On the good side, UK successes in the Indo-Pacific are plentiful. They provide ample room to grow in. The UK-Australia FTA, for those of you that don't know, contains one of the most forward-looking innovation clauses of any free trade agreement. CPTPP accounts for 15% of global GDP, just north of what the EU's is, and UK accession to it is frankly extraordinary. Similarly, UK achieving dialogue partner status to ASEAN, accounting for the UK's third largest export market in financial services. As Dr. John has mentioned a few times today, GCAP will produce the world's most advanced, complex, sixth-generation combat aircraft system with Japan and Italy. The UK-India's Technical Security Initiative of last year at DNSA level here preceded the free trade agreement that we've just announced. FPDA announcement between the UK, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia and New Zealand is very likely to ramp up. And the Royal Navy is at the defence helm of the UK efforts. Carrier Strike Group 21 demonstrated the UK's ability to work with 42 nations to and from Australia, while CSG 25, just south of Suez as we speak, is international by design and en route to both Australia and Japan as well. All while we're permanently positioning Type 23 frigates, mine hunters and offshore patrol vessels across the Indo-Pacific, thereby learning that we can have ships permanently stationed with rotating crews and we can therefore remain wedded in theatre. We've also secured a number of important alliances and accords that cement our alliances in Northeast Asia. The UK-Japan Hiroshima Accords, the UK-South Korea Downing Street Accords, the AUKUS partnership and its potential expansion of Pillar 2 contributors to include allies such as Japan. These demonstrate the indivisibility between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific that has always existed. But I know that it hasn't all gone well. The 1997 50-year UK-China agreement over Hong Kong being one of them. China being allowed to create a second adversarial nuclear power in the Pacific with North Korea. China's attempt to consider the nine-side South China Sea as its 9, 10 or 11 territorial line, whichever it numbers, is a threat to all of us. Nothing more and nothing less. Beyond this security threat, there is a good news story to tell. For when combined, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea and Taiwan represent an overwhelming majority of global wealth-generating economies, and they are marked by their allied status, something that China needs to be lectured about in its absence. Together, they dwarf China's economic strength, which has still not reached a GDP per capita of any note beyond some African countries. We must see the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific as one strategic operating environment, particularly in the underwater domain, co-joined by the Arctic Ocean in what I call the horizontal strategic plane, in no different a way that we see the Baltic and Black Seas in the vertical strategic plane, with significant maritime effects in one affecting the other. And we must secure in AUKUS, Pillar 2 particularly, what I call enduring strategic technological dominance over the risks of oscillating operational advantage for the warfighting commander. The global economic meridian is shifting to Asia, and it is aligned along the sea, not centered on Beijing. The ability of Asia to generate technological innovations and advances is astonishing. Their work ethic, manufacturing potential, skilled labor, technical staff, and their faith in democracy itself, as demonstrated in South Korea recently, are strong and offer an overwhelming strategic advantage to us all if we care to reflect on it. However, when set as competitors, they will achieve so much less. UK policy options include joining the Partnership for Indo-Pacific Industrial Resilience, which would enable UK industry greater access to Asia's defence market, formulating a coherent strategy for a Taiwan contingency should the US request support, accelerate Pillar 2 and articulate its ambition publicly that it is about drawing a line in the strategic sand against the possibility of China assuming leadership in the world, but base it on a strategic technological dominance ambition in the Rickover, Blackett, Wallace, and Newtonian traditions. Ensuring AUKUS is effectively mobilised to maintain and develop the UK's SSBN and SSN capabilities. Consider adjusting the UK's nuclear posture to enable SSNs to carry them. Make more with less. Consider forward basing one of our aircraft carriers in Japan and rotating UK crews in the same way that we've done with other vessels. Consider combining Asian-based air groups to place on those carriers. Send a signal of permanence and a signal of defence confidence in who we are. And work with some soft options too. Even at the cultural level, the UK has world-class unfulfilled strategic advantage. And I cannot resist telling you that the Indian Cricket League itself is worth $12 billion, which the UK seems curiously absent from. Another important factor in reassessing the role of the UK in the Indo-Pacific is our NATO commitment. I'll finish shortly. For the future of NATO, it will prove essential for its command and control structures, at the very least, to be used by Western allies as we move into the Indo-Pacific. I recognize the problems that may cause for some allies. I'm not suggesting NATO expands. I recognize that the timeliness for success are becoming increasingly compressed and that we can't afford to keep debating this every year. The UK and NATO must draw their most probable readiness timings from Admiral Franchetti's US navigation plan of last year, in which he clearly stated 2027 as the date by which the US Navy needs to be prepared for war with China and possibly Russia. This necessitates us all to make good on our whole of government, whole of nation, and whole of society concepts, reforming the UK's public and private sector relationship, and specifically within the United Kingdom, the defence science industry one. We have a moral obligation as a country which has given so much to the world of its, and given it its freedoms, its hopes, and the frameworks by which we exist to future generations. We should never doubt our steel or our ability to carry forward those ideas despite the complexities and the distortions of our modern age.
Thank you very much, Carl. And you said, very interestingly, how it is important that we stand with our partners, and in particular the US. And that it's important that we understand what is going on in the US mind. So giving the word to Mike, I wanted to ask him, of course, in general, if he can assess the role of the UK in the Indo-Pacific, but also specifically, based on your own experience, what is going on in the US mind? That would be very interesting.
Yeah. Which mind you asked me to interpret here? So I was going to comment in the beginning here that we have to redefine the word brilliance. You talked about it being a fine heart and a fine mind, but I think you just saw also fine words here to define brilliance. So well done down the line. I was mystified as to why I was asked to be an American, a Yank, talking about British, foreign policy and what you should do. I mean, you've been lectured by Americans for so long here. You want to engender another one. So I come here like humbly with a few ideas. I wanted to hear what Winnie and Carl had to say and maybe riff off some things, but then add some new ones. I thought to myself, maybe you guys figured out that I belong here because my mother's British. And so I'm actually able to span the Atlantic based on my loyalties to an American father and a British mother. My grandfather was in the Royal Navy and fought in World War II as a submariner. And so, my ties do span kind of this long distance across the ocean. And then I thought, no, this is not the reason why you put me here. The answer is because you looked at my title and said you're a rear admiral, and therefore I should be on the back end of all the panels and the speakers. So that's probably the right reason, correct? Yeah. Okay, so thanks for all the commentary here and the questions. And I may be a little scattered here. First of all, I wanted to say that as I was preparing, I looked at the integrated review and the refresh, and there's much to commend both of those reviews, and I expect that there'll be some clarity of thought too coming out on Monday with the defense review. And so I was ticking off those things, that Carl and Winnie were mentioning here. The only one that I didn't see, which I also think is in these reviews that deserves mention, and it relates to John's question, also about who the British side should be working with, is the partners in the Blue Pacific, because that's Five Eyes, but it's also Japan and Germany and the ROK. And so this dealing with the Pacific Island countries often get forgotten. But clearly are viewed as very strategically valuable to the Chinese. The Americans have gotten a little more savvy with regard to what's actually happening in those ocean areas. And it's much like what the Japanese were doing as they prepared before World War II in setting up stations or islands that could serve strategic purposes, if there was a war and if there were issues with regard to cutting off Australia and constraining, Allied operations. So this is underway today. It's not something you should suspect. It's confirmed that this is part of the PRC strategy, and therefore we shouldn't just leave it up to Australia and New Zealand to sort of guard that area. It's a large space, so to the extent that there are multiple countries that then can also lend a hand in all the ways that countries help one another, I think that's going to be really important for setting the theater in a way that makes sense. So I think ASEAN is sort of in a good place, not to be taken for granted. The relations with India are special in many ways, and I think that's going to require some conversations here about what it means for operations in the Indian Ocean there in a way that works for all parties. AUKUS is in a good place. And so I do think the setting, it looks pretty good right now. But the question that I think the offices in London are going to have to answer is whether or not you have a Pacific tilt here or if it's a Pacific wobble. So time will tell whether or not you follow your own strategies and your own words. And I found that on the U.S. side, we have the same problem. We write the most beautiful strategy documents that have the priorities, and then when we try to execute them, it's all haphazard and we actually don't follow what we say. And so follow through matters in all of these different things, and everyone is watching to see whether or not, in fact, this is bluster or if this is real, and then how real and important is it? I think it's really important, obviously, to have the ways and the means, line up with your ends, and they have to work, and so you can't operate outside of your means, but it does mean, I think, you can be far more creative with your ways and using all instruments of national power. I don't think that we have enough expertise in any government that wants to operate in the Pacific yet to be able to inform our policy making. And so Chris and I were talking about this earlier, but I think we need to develop the human capital first to be able to really make the smartest choices about where we apply any energies as nations that are interested in shaping things here. And so I think looking very hard at building our benches with regard to who's really experienced in the Indo-Pacific, who's done time there, who's actually been part of exchanges, who's been educated, what languages they speak, and where they're placed in our respective governments. That really matters. We're too thin on the United States side, and I would argue that all of our allies are also too thin, and you can't rely on just-in-time researcher coming from a think tank. These people, these experts, need to be side by side those who are struggling with implementing policy and formulating it, and it has to be baked into our organizations. And you have so many organizations that have a role in this, that means you have to have that many more experts that are resident that can immediately contribute to those things that you don't want to get wrong, all right? So you have very limited energy, and then how you focus it and in what ways has to have the sort of cultural, historical understanding of the region, and to know what works over here may in fact not work for you over there. How do you actually deal with the Chinese on their own terms? Require somebody with that kind of background, because I think we've too often brought a Western lens to how to deal with a very proud, very ambitious, and a very strong country in China. So, the bench has to be, I think, there. I would also say that we need to invest more between us as countries in NATO and with our alliances in the Western Pacific in what I call the invisible capabilities. And those include things that you don't see, space capability, but all of that obviously very much matters. Cyber capabilities, electromagnetic warfare capabilities. You will win or you will lose if you're in a contingency if you underestimate what you need in those invisible capabilities. And the fact of the matter is we have a challenger who has invested very heavily in this. So even as we have some recognition that they're important, you need to have the capacity and the capability to be able to contend against, your up-and-coming challengers. And I am not convinced that we're prepared. And I think on any one of them, the nature of the outcome will go. On the cyber front, the ability of the Chinese to be able to hold British critical infrastructure and key resources at risk, the ability for them to do so in the United States, and the list of countries goes on, is very significant. And so, as we maybe unpack this one a little bit more, I would say, we need to get a stronger sense of how do we protect ourselves. So we talk about that maybe doing things forward. Well, helping yourself forward begins with doing things at home, and that includes having a protective shell or more armor on our soft underbellies, protecting our intellectual property and warding off those threats that would threaten to hold our critical infrastructure at risk and affect each citizen in a way that they probably don't really expect today. Another point I would make is that we are underinvested in the information arm of government. We say that the information domain is important. We have a number of different things we do in information operations or cyber or what have you, public affairs, but I don't see in fact that we're as good as we need to be. And so what it takes to strengthen your information instrument involves a number of capabilities, processes, skill sets, et cetera, and maybe a new kind of person that we have in government. A new kind of person that doesn't, so if you're public affairs, typically your forte is that you're going to paint blue friendly for what blue is, because you don't want anybody to misconstrue what you said, what you did, your why, right? That's where public affairs typically ends. But we need people that can actually describe that, but also paint red for what red is. And the fact of the matter is you have very few people that are equipped to be at a podium with any kind of authority to be able to puncture the false narratives of our adversaries. And this is their weakest part, and it's in fact their greatest fear. Their greatest fear, once again said in an earlier panel, was our story. To the extent we don't tell our story about freedom and values and how the systems should operate, right, you give them license to essentially take over the narrative. So how do you go ahead and attack those distortions that they have, but also tell your story in a way that has to be told? I think we've forgotten how to do it. Where's your Churchillian moments where are they from London these days regarding these conditions, right? Same can be true of the United States. Now, we have a worse story to tell now, and so our message may get mangled. But I do think that we need to think through how that information domain really operates, and you have to go on the offensive here. You have to use China's history against it, just like we have to own our own history when they use their narrative and their rhetoric. We need to do the same. Call out the CCP for what it is. Call out the totalitarian state for what it is. Be able to describe how they are not the defender of international institutions and the multilateral order if they do the following things that actually controvert what they're saying. So we need to expose the contradictions for the CCP just like we expose the contradictions of the Soviet Union over time. And this is steady, constant gardening with experts that actually know what they're talking about and can handle the third level question that will come in press conferences. Who is that person in the British government? Who is that person in the US government? I could go on. And I would tell you that you've actually done it well. I saw, and he's a good colleague here, General Sir Jim Hockenhull was the guy that you put forward when Russia invaded Ukraine. And even though he had a full-time job with intelligence, he was the guy that was chosen to explain, right, not just to England, but to Europe and the rest of the world, exactly how to interpret what Russia was doing, exploded the myths and the narratives that Russia was trying to create, a pivotal player at a pivotal time. We need that steady state. Who's the General Hockenhull for China that you have available to you? Because something new on China breaks every week, right? And so if we strengthen there, I think we could go far in using all of our instruments and not just some of them to be able to get the effects that we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have a lot of questions, but before I wanted to ask John, because I've already asked some questions, and I wanted to ask John if you have any questions for our panelists.
Thank you, Alice. Well, first of all, I mean, one of the things that's wonderful about this panel is, we have an academic, someone representing business, and someone who is at the cutting edge of military policy. And we've heard here, I think, a wonderful description of the big conceptual issues, very practical ideas about what needs to be done. And we should be optimistic, I think, because we've been able to identify the scale of the challenge. But if I can ask each of you, based on your individual presentations, one or two very quick questions to reflect on. Winnie, you talked about transparency and consistency. One of the criticisms of previous administrations, and particularly of Boris Johnson, was that there seemed to be the perception that on key issues to do with the rule of law, and when we think about the attempted proroguing of Parliament, the debate over the Northern Ireland Protocol, trust in government, all of that seemed to suggest that there might be some contradiction, and this comes back to your point about messages, between what was happening domestically and what we were trying to do internationally. How has that changed, if it has changed? What role has the Starmer government played in doing that? And secondly, given that we have this direct experience now that the Starmer government has had in negotiating with the Trump administration over the trade agreement, however we choose to define it, how does Britain share its lessons from having succeeded in that particular encounter with other countries? Because one of the questions that we're often facing is how do like-minded formal allies or informal allies work together to work with the United States, given all the uncertainty? Carl, to you, if I may, you've sort of set out an image of kind of a strategic vision that is bipartisan. And John Bew's example in advising both governments is an illustration of that, if you like, strategic community that exists in the British government. But that's not always the case in other governments. South Korea, we know, is very divided. What is it from our own historical experience and your direct experience of seeing how government works with industry and the private sector that allows that coherent strategic thinking to be laid out? And particularly when we consider now with the rise of reform, how in that very impressive and ambitious list of all the things that we can do and should be doing. How do you insulate that from political pressure? This question that I opened with, which is, how do you persuade the British public that these issues are really existential? Because you used, I think, really important language. You talked about a moral obligation, which again resonates with Mike's point about language and narratives. What does that look like? How do you make the argument? And Mike, finally to you, the issue of expertise seems really, really important. And sitting here in a university which is grappling with cuts in budgets, and when I think about the challenges we face in the academic community to persuade the British government to really invest in funding expertise, and coming from the American system, what can be done to incentivize the private sector to keep the government's feet to the fire, to actually make the argument for saying that we should be investing in the sort of experts that we need to deliver, whether it's a message or to provide the insight into the nature of the challenges we face in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm bound to ask, this may be an overly sensitive question, given your role in government, but a lot of anxiety in the United Kingdom, given very senior personnel appointments in the American government, about our special intelligence relationship with the United States. How do we maintain trust and share information with Washington and with other allies at a time, as you very eloquently explained, the challenges are happening in real time at a very, very rapid pace. We need that information, but there must be surely some questions in Whitehall and particularly in the intelligence community about how we maintain that dialogue. So those are my opening questions. I know we want to get to questions from the floor, so I don't want to ask any more, but perhaps you can address some of them or all of those if possible, and then we'll open up for questions from the floor. In any order. Maybe Winnie, if you want to go first.
Okay. So I think a lot of what the questions you're asking, at least the two that you proposed to me, have a lot to do with UK's agency, and whether it has to do with how the government engages domestically or as well as internationally. The transparency that we are historically known for, and the consistency that we're historically known for. You used the Boris Johnson government as, what happened under COVID, or, the idea of the contradiction that we're seeing there is something that is not limited to the domestic arena. And so there's problems behind, in the domestic arena around Brexit in terms of it was not transparent. Concerns now that we're experiencing the results of Brexit and the transparency that was not demonstrated to the population when the vote was taking place. And this spills over separately in the international arena in terms of the fact that the UK has been inconsistent in its engagement with the international arena in terms of we had this idea of global Britain, but there was no follow through with what that would look like. We tried to revive the whole idea of what we were going to do with the Commonwealth, but we didn't engage with the Commonwealth, right? And so in the absence of this, what you have is a significant kind of, gap in terms of communication. And that has, from what I've observed and from communications with various people, established a significant trust deficit in terms of not just what does the UK stand for, whether it has to do with Indo-Pacific, or whether it has to do with China, or whether it has to do with Europe, but also what does the UK want for the UK in this context. And so when it comes to the idea of the trade agreement that we negotiated with the Trump government, there is the claim that could be made that saying that we're taking leadership, we're showing that we can work with America, with the transatlantic alliance remains strong, and that's cool. But there's been some backlash to that as well, in terms of the fact that a lot of the terms and the detail of what that agreement represents for the long haul is not particularly clear. which goes back to the issue of transparency. And it goes back to the point of this idea of leadership that may come out of interpretations of the agreement doesn't hold water when you think about the potential implications of the interpretation of the agreement itself. And so China's response, for instance, to the US-UK agreement they highlighted their own issues with it. I think what we need to understand is that in order for us to utilize and draw upon the skill sets and the assets and the soft power that we have, particularly in the area of our reputation and our knowledge around governance. Like if you're talking about AI governance, if you're talking about leadership, or helping to lead a team in the area of establishing a foundation for climate change, that has been left by this America leaving the multilateral system in these specific areas, right? So we could fill that vacuum. There is potential for that, but we're not stepping up the way we could, right? And I think the big concern becomes a matter of what we say is not necessarily represented by the political realities of what's going on. And if we want to represent ourselves as being a consistent and comprehensive player to be taken seriously on the international stage, we need to find a way to actually stop being painted with a broad brush in our foreign policy and our strategic interests that is basically a replication of America. Because we're not America. We're not nowhere near in the same kind of position economically, politically, diplomatically, right? And there are a lot of reasons that the current Trump government highlights that there is a significant difference between America and the UK. And by not taking that stand, we're at risk of that, further eroding the already deficit we have with regards to trust on the international stage.
So just 2 seconds. So, for instance, as you say that, Winnie, I was very struck that if you look at the Commonwealth in the Indo-Pacific and you include Canada as a Pacific country, it is exactly, then there are 20 members of the 54 nations of the Commonwealth that are in the Indo-Pacific. And the person that has done most the two people that have done most for the Commonwealth, in my opinion, are, to your point, bipartisan. They're politically neutral. And that is Her Majesty the Queen, who's passed, and His Majesty the King, as now. And both of them have visited our Commonwealth countries in the Indo-Pacific far more than any political leader we have. And the most impactful thing for Canada, as far as I can see from the Prime Minister of Canada, has been the recent His Majesty the King's opening of Parliament. So everything in my bones, I'm quite happy to disclose my politics when asked in private, but everything in my bones says that the brilliance of this country is when it is bipartisan and when it is sharing what I call a national shared endeavour. I think the Admiral would probably agree with me that if you really want to succeed in life, you have to do a couple of things first. And what I tell my undergraduates and graduates is, know your qualities, apply them to what you think you will enjoy most, and money and success will follow. The distortion of Cambridge as the university that generates more Nobel Prize winners for science at one of your colleges than the entire nation of a neighbouring peer country with a capital beginning with P is extraordinary. But you should not take pride in generating your graduates so that they can earn oodles of money unless that deeply connects to the nobility of their purpose first. And the nobility of their purpose should, in my view, be a bipartisan objective to understand in current complexity that we are in a near war 1939 age concurrently with being in a post-war 1945 age. The Admiral, who is an extraordinary man, asked for some Churchillian language. So I can give you an example. How can it be that we are so bewildered about our current and future prospects when everything we have at our disposal tells you with a certainty, moral and actual, that you will prevail at any moment you are called upon, because we have form and experience in it? How can it be that in 1949, at home, we created the National Health Service and the welfare state to protect our people through their moments of indignity with dignity, whilst at the same time creating equality for women under the law, whilst overseas, with America, creating the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, an equal member Commonwealth and NATO itself, all at a time when GDP to debt was 250% and when bread itself was rationed for 9 long years. Please let us have some hope that despite all the complexities that Dr. Winnie describes so well, I am certainly quite happy to work more than 20 hours a day to help us get through this little local difficulty. But it means we have to prevail. And we can, as long as we really read that integrated review, take the advice that Professor John Bugett advised us, and say, there's no time for any of this political factionalization anymore. There is only a call for nobility to win for the right reasons. And I am absolutely confident that we can do that.
Thoroughly Churchillian. Nicely done. So to the 2 questions here, the first one was about how to encourage and incentivize some of the expertise that you talked about. I would just maybe offer for an example to consider how we do similar things in the United States. So in the intelligence community, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence has set up a program where they work with universities that apply for becoming a center of academic excellence for intelligence. And so they provide low millions over the course of 4 or 5 years, but it's very competitive. And if you qualify, if you have programs that actually allow students to then become more familiar with intelligence based on the course load, the course types that they're taking, and including internships that occur over the course of that fellowship, and including getting a clearance, where they apply as a junior, might do something as a senior. And so by the time they graduate, they tend to be choice selectees for coming right into CIA, DIA, whatever it is, right? And so that's an intelligence fellows program. So the question might be, I mean, you set up, we call them strategic affairs specialism, is how you characterize it. So if you have strategic affairs, this term that you want to start, so the question is, where are you going to grow your strategic affairs expertise? And I think the fellows program is a good example. You like the word, I've seen, the fellows everywhere, only fellows on the grass, right? How are you going to set something up here that conforms with your lexicon, your preferences, and creates a feeder pipeline where there will be winners. There'll be some colleges that'll be better prepared to actually feed that kind of expertise into your government, right? They don't necessarily have to go into government, right? They have a choice whether or not they want to go into private industry, academia, or anything else. But you've set up that program to provide more structure and to provide more tailored inputs with regard to the kind of commodity, essential intellectual commodity that you want to have. That's just one example of how to do it. On intelligence and maintaining the dialogue, we have great fear that given the politics of the moment that some of our finished intelligence, when it goes to its final checks, may be politicized. I think that's the greatest danger right now. But intelligence professionals are just that. They maintain their focus on doing the right thing for the right reasons, regardless of partisanship. And you can expect that within the intelligence community that's going to be the same, that we will do our utmost to share the most. We do a lot of eye-watering sharing between the Five Eyes partners. That will continue, and we're considering adding more. The question will always be for an intelligence professional to provide that radical candor and then speaking truth to power no matter what. And if you start to see intelligence officials being fired, which I fully expect that you're going to find that will be the case. You already maybe detected a snafu with some of the National Intelligence Council, assessments, that people will in fact stand up for what is right, and you will find that they'll have to be fired to be moved out of the way. Those are the kind of professionals that I've worked with and are still in the system and will always do the right thing.
Thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, we should take some questions from the floor. So I see here there is like Brendan and Kathy, and then someone in the back. And also the lady in the front as well.
Thank you very much. I'm Brendan Sims. I co-direct the centre with Bill Hurst. Really interesting panel. My question arises out of something that Carl said, which I completely agreed with, which was his point that, his argument that Indo-Pacific and Europe are one operational space, and they're one political space, strategic space. And that's very much also the view, I think, on the other side of the world. I was very struck, John and I were very struck when we went to Japan, that they were profoundly concerned with what was happening in Ukraine. And the phrase that their deputy defense minister used was, we, that is the Japanese, face the head of the dragon and the tail of the bear, and you, i.e. the Europeans, face the head of the bear and the tail of the dragon. But my question arises out of the fact that you also said that we help a friend in need wherever he or she is, no matter which part of the world. But of course, you can only be in one place at once. And so what I'd be interested to know from you, and perhaps from other members of the panel, is how does one negotiate that? I mean, if, for example, you know, a friend were in need in East Asia, but also friends who have a more clearly articulated treaty right to expect help, say the Estonians, are also threatened. How do you set a priority? How do you then recognize what you've said about these two areas being linked, but not, as it were, overextend?
So Professor Brennan, I love that description that you've come up with, Dr. John. I mean, I think that's stunning in the way that each sees their respective company. So thank you. Thank you for all you do here, and I know your 10th book is about to be published, so many congratulations for that. So for me, it's about evaluating things like concentration of force, location of it as well. But the bottom line, actually what I did say was that if you look at a map in a different way, you'll see that if you stand on the east coast of England on the line of the meridian, the next piece of land that you get to, if you go north, go over the pole and carry on true south, is actually Pacific Russia. Actually what I said was that you have to see the Indo-Pacific, Euro-Atlantic and Arctic as one strategic operating environment. I don't mean to correct you of all people here, but just for clarity, that's what I mean. And I believe AUKUS is actually about, in Pillar 1 on the submarine side, is about effectively, and the Admiral may not see it this way, I'm just talking about geostrategically, that actually what it gives you is between the three major powers who are actually determined to do something about the supposed rise of China, is effectively in Pillar 1 creating at least the capability to have an underwater force that can be cohered and operated as one strategic operating force. We tend, therefore, to realize that, therefore, if you're creating one strategic operating force for one strategic operating environment, the answer is that that concentration of force enables you to divide that force as and when required. We have to very simply understand that if the two serious players that oppose our ideals and hopes and futures are Russia and China, then I'm afraid you're going to have to resource your capabilities so you can confront both at the same time, since Ukraine appears to me to have brought them together in a way that they weren't before. Therefore, it's academic to me to talk about NATO first, and we don't mean that to mean NATO only. You need to absolutely get on whatever program it is you need to be to understand that just as in business, I haven't got, my manufacturing company is a high exporting one. I don't have the choice to decide whether I'm exporting to America or the Far East. The reality is I'm not going to be a successful company if I don't do both concurrently. My emphasis of complexity in my mind is probably consumed by issues of the moment, but my strategic direction will never be changed by localized emphasis. So I know I'm not answering your question particularly, but you have to go home first, as the Admiral said. I'm afraid the discussions that you would have with Dr. John and excite me with what I've learnt from you every time I meet you is different to what our nation understands. And hence why I'm calling really for national strategic thought to be done, accelerated and communicated in a politically neutral way so that our own people understand where we are going, having understood who they are first. To that degree, I just finished with this quick one. Who in this country really knows about the relationship between, whether you're of faith or not, between faith, monarchy, parliament, government, and the people? If you don't understand each of those relationships, it's no surprise that you produce 30% turnouts in some elections, or you produce governments now that we have 61% of parliamentary seats provided by 31% of those who voted for it and 21% for those who didn't. In other words, if you understood that actually over 1,000 years, monarchical power has transferred to Parliament and ministers exercise it in his or her name, and that the relationship with the people is that every time they vote, they therefore touch the powers of their sovereign, which would in itself depoliticize whoever party they're voting for. Wouldn't that be a little bit more exciting than to suggest that you've obtained a mandate for government from a manifesto that you've never read? And all I'm trying to say is, if we just describe to ourselves who we are, the majesty of His Majesty will soon transcend into the majesty in ourselves.
Thank you very much, Carl. So I think we can take some questions. So I think Kath was about to ask a question, and then like this lady in the front, and then I see there is also a question right behind Kath. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to be pithy, and I'm jumping off something that Winnie said. If I asked you what is one success criteria for the UK in the Indo-Pacific, what would it be? Where would it be applied to? So where is the geographic scope, to go back to Bill's comments from yesterday? And over what time period should it be achieved? Answers on a postcard.
Thank you for the excellent insights. I'm Merlene Emerson from Paddy Ashdown Forum, which is a think tank trying to bridge the East and West. So if I may make a couple of comments before my question. I don't know if you know that the High Commissioner to Singapore is Nikesh Mehta of Asian descent, and the one to Malaysia is AJ Sharma, also of Asian descent. So my question is, do you think that this is deliberately to allow the High Commissioners to relate better to the countries that they are visiting? Is it putting Britain and its past colonies on a more equal footing? Or is it just by chance that those people were the best people for the job?
Thank you. At a time of heightened Sino-Western competition, we all know that the Starmer government in the United Kingdom recently agreed to sign away the Chagos Islands for a not insignificant sum of money. What implications does this have on Britain's role and Britain's reputation in the Indo-Pacific? It's hardly a surprise that China's ambassador to Mauritius hailed this deal only a couple of days ago as a significant achievement.
Thank you. I think because we're a little bit late, so if any of you maybe want to address like one or a couple of questions, maybe we can start with Winnie.
Okay, so I'll respond to Kath. An area of success. Something that I think is realistic is the UK taking a major role in terms of AI governance and establishing we can't do it on our own because, there's so many different definitions and prioritizations of what AI governance would be in, talking about Europe, America, China. But I think we represent a good middle ground player to provide a kind of middle forum within which we can establish some kind of framework for AI governance. I don't know what the content will be. I do think it will, in terms of the timeline you suggested, it would be evolving, yeah? Because AI is dynamic in nature. So I'm just gonna put that there and, that's it.
Thank you very much. And Carl?
Just very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but I'd say, ma'am, the one example was the CSG 25 at the moment sailing out to the Far East. it is international by design. Those are MOD words, not mine. But I think the great thing about that is that it didn't even have to be stated for countries to be asking to join it even before it went. Now, you may take a negative view and say that we had to do that because the current fleet is diminished, but either way, it's happening, and that's probably how you're going to go to war too.
On Chagos Island, I'd just say that there's a reinforcement that ultimately all the parties made the right decision, and we supported what the rules-based international system really calls for here, right? If we had waited and not made a deal, then you would have had maybe the entire strategic presence there that multiple countries find valuable compromised, right? And so this arrangement that's been made to give Chagos Island back to Mauritius, but also to set up a 99-year lease where we pay back, you pay back, the combination of burden sharing financially between the United States and the UK. This is exactly a win-win-win across the board here. Doing the right thing, showing that you're following a legal process, not operating unilaterally, respecting Mauritius's rights, at the same time sustaining that place as a strategic asset in a very volatile 21st century when we absolutely need it as a strong point for the good guys.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I'm afraid we've run out of time, even if I know that you probably have a lot of questions. But thank you very much to our distinguished panelists for joining us today, and thank you to everyone for the discussion. I guess we can continue to discuss over drinks downstairs. Thank you.